I've had hypnagogic hallucinations for as long as I can remember. Those flashes of unreality that pop up just on the cusp of sleep. Mine were usually tactile, or occasionally auditory. I couldn't count the number of times that I'd jolt back to full wakefulness to the feeling of innumerable insects, or a breath on my neck, or hands grasping at my exposed skin. For one memorable month, I was disturbed every night by the approaching footsteps of a recently deceased pet. They don't really bother me anymore. I've been used to them for years. That's why I wasn't concerned at first, when I started seeing the grey hag. I'd only moved into my new apartment a few weeks before her first appearance. It was the first properly cool night of the season, and I was pleasantly nestled down under my doona. I only caught the barest glimpse of her, just the barest impression of age and hair and approach, but it was enough to send me bolt upright and scrambling for my lamp, heart pounding harder than it had in years. I'm fully aphantasic, usually, even in my dreams. Her, though, I could see. It took me longer than I'd usually care to admit to soothe myself enough that I could turn the lights back off. And when I managed it, I still needed to have my bedding cocooned up as far as I could handle, eyes screwed tightly closed against the darkness of my room. She didn't appear again that night, thankfully, though that may have had more to do with my tense sleeplessness than anything else. She did show up the next night, though, and the next, and the next, and the next. I'd started to calm down about the whole thing by about the fourth night. Years of skepticism pushing away any lingering concerns. I actually started to lean into the experience a little. Even though my stomach tightened with dread every time she popped up, it was still an exciting experience to be able to visualize something so vivid, so real. She seemed to get a little bit clearer each night, as I caught more of the details. A pruned but surprisingly normal visage framed by grey-white hair, so long that it bled out into the darkness around her. I could never quite imagine her eyes, but her hand was always prominent, always reaching towards me with its scraggy nails and its paper-thin skin. On the sixth night, I heard her call my name in my mother's voice. That was the end of my fascination with her, as strange as it seems. But with that simple addition, she seemed so much more present, so much closer, and I was done. It was a tense night, that sixth. I spent it desperately still, too afraid to empty my bladder, too afraid to roll over, too afraid to even breathe naturally, lest some tiny movement or hitch draw even more of her attention. I spent the seventh night at my parents' house, and armed with a good night's sleep and a reassuring chat over coffee, I had the courage to weather the eighth in my own bed. Things were stable for a while. She still flashed up every night, reaching out for me, and she called my name maybe one night in 3, but with a little time, and a careful refusal to acknowledge in the vision. I started to learn how to let myself continue on to sleep past this newest hallucination. It was only ever an issue just as I was drifting off after all. She didn't even appear in nightmares, so it wasn't that difficult to catch an uninterrupted night's sleep. She finally touched me on the 39th night. It was only the briefest moment, as usual, but it was still enough to clearly discern the touch. 3 distinct points of contact brushed against my face, her fingers trailing a mere centimetre across my cheek before she was snatched away by the night. I had my hand on my lamp switch before I could even consider that movement might be a bad idea, flooding the room with its sharp white light. There was nothing there, of course, but I could still feel the icy cold of her fingers on my face, intensifying by the minute as I pressed myself against the headboard, eyes flickering around the room. I knew that I'd have to do something when they started to hurt, and so I flung myself out of bed before I could let myself reconsider, hitting every light switch that I could reach between my bed and the bathroom. Obscuring my view of the bathroom with steam seemed dangerous, so I ran the hot water tap into the basin instead of turning on the shower. I checked the area over in the mirror as I waited for the water to heat. 3 slightly reddened patches met my inspection, as though I'd rested ice cubes on my skin for a moment too long. The warm water from the basin seemed to ease the sting a little, and continued application of a washcloth soaked in it provided better and better results. I spent the night there, sitting on the counter so that I could set my back into the corner, periodically refreshing the temperature of the water. By morning, the pain had stopped entirely, and the patches had settled into the barely there blue of an underdeveloped bruise. My parents let me stay for 3 nights this time, before they gently pushed me back to my own apartment. I don't blame them. This would hardly be the first time that I'd burst in babbling about something touching me. The 43rd night was spent once more in my own bed, albeit with my bedroom light blazing. And nothing happened. I eventually managed to drift off towards sleep, despite my pounding heart and bright room. But all that floated past my consciousness was the faintest scent of mildew. I made a mental note to wipe the bathroom down the next day and let myself fall fully asleep, waking up in the morning feeling as rested as I ever did. The smell was even stronger the next night, despite my efforts, and strangely tinged with bleach, which I hadn't used. Still, a bad odour was hardly an alarming experience, and I didn't let it bother me too much, simply leaving the windows open while I was at work the next day so that it would air out. It didn't help. By the 6th night, the smell of mildew and bleach had reached almost unbearable levels. The handyman that I'd hired hadn't been able to find any signs of mould or chemical damage, and since the smell only came while I was on the cusp of sleep, clearly believed I was entirely hysterical. There was little choice in the end but to accept that the smell was illusory and unaddressable. I decided that I could live with that. There was no risk to my health if it wasn't real, and I'd rather have the smell than the hag. I set up a bucket next to the bed in case the smell overcame me, and settled into my newest sleep dysfunction. She didn't even wait for me to start falling asleep on the 7th night. I'd just turned off the lights and snuggled down into my blankets when the sound of a raspy breath reached me. I held my breath as I lay there, knowing that I was fully awake, but the breathing continued. Gradually, my eyes adjusted to the dark, and then I could start to make her out. An all too familiar silhouette slouched over in the corner. She was gone when I turned on the light, and then back again as soon as I turned it off. The solution seemed fairly obvious, if problematic for my power bill. I continued on like that for another 3 weeks, constantly in the light. Occasionally I'd see her for a moment in the dark closet, or in a new room before I hit the light switch. But if she was inclined to do anything in those brief snatches, she never got the chance. I learned to sleep in the light, and I actually haven't had a hypnagogic episode in that time. But I have a different issue now. My bedroom light burned out about 4 o'clock this morning. The popping noise of it pulled me awake, and it took me a moment to shake off the disorientation of sleep enough to realise what was going on. There she was, standing in her usual corner. She didn't make any sort of movement towards me, not while I came fully awake, not while I reached slowly for the lamp. She just stood there, the heavy sound of her breathing overpowering even my own. I've been writing this for the last couple of hours while I waited for the sun to rise. She just stood there the entire time, unmoving, bathed in the light of first my lamp and now the sun. She hasn't moved yet, but I can see her eyes now.